for the enjoyable final, and Prime Minister, whenever you're ready.
Okay, so my time starts in 3, 2, 1. Crime is detrimental for obvious reasons. It appeals to the poor, ruins their lives, traumatizes victims, and on a larger scale, even changes society's perception of a certain minority group. Having said that, this is the reason why, assuming the technology exists, we would like to erase the memories of society's memories of the crime after their sentence has been completed. So let's move on to definitions. Just to clarify something, when they completed the sentence, so during the sentence, people will not forget, therefore we still achieve deterrence. Secondly, I would like to give our model. Firstly, we're going to put a lot of emphasis on rehabilitation. So we're going to have a lot of education in jail on how these criminals are able to function in society. And secondly, we're going to also focus on reducing recidivism. Secondly, that we're not going to have any public records. However, both the person who committed the crime are going to retain those memories as well as their private government records. So for example, we'll allow people to vote again, but their public records, like when they're getting employed, that is all going to be clean and nothing is going to be on those records. And thirdly, we will also try to cover up crimes that can be covered up. In today's debate, we are trying to achieve two things. Firstly, we want to help the criminals, and secondly, we're going to help society, and we're going to prove those two things in our two arguments, which is firstly that we have the principle high ground. We have 3 layers of analysis for this. Firstly, proportionality. A lot of these criminals as the motion states, these criminals have already been punished. They have been given a sentence and now they finished it. They got out of jail, they paid their bail, whatever. However, in the status quo, a lot of them are punished for life. They are refused by jobs, they are isolated by society because of the crime they committed. They're no longer able to rehabilitate because of that one mistake they made or the one crime they committed. We believe that this is unjust because as the sentence was given, that is supposed to be it. That was the proportion to the crime. However, these people are suffering way more than they should, and we believe that is not proportional and it's going against one of the main principles of this criminal justice system. Secondly, we believe that most of these people are actually poor. They are usually the ones coerced into crime, like especially racial minorities are the ones who are going to be greatly affected. So these kinds of poor people, they don't have a job. They probably are falling apart. They really don't have any alternative but to turn to crime to literally survive. Like a lot of poor people have to rob stores in order to get their food because they simply have no other option. Therefore, society coerces them into making a turn to crime. And we believe that that is the majority of the people, of the criminals that we are talking about today. Thirdly, we have government duty. Because the government failed these poor people by coercing them and putting them into a situation where they actually have to turn to crime, it is also our duty to actually help them rehabilitate. It is our principal duty and principal of responsibility to help them rehabilitate and help them find a life and help them learn from their mistakes so they can actually live a fulfilling life later on. And also to quickly preempt, if the opposition tries to say that we are not going to be able to, or these murderers and rapists, those kinds of people, their criminal crimes will be erased, we believe that these people are already going to have lifelong sentences. Therefore, they're still going to be in jail. It's still going to be, so we believe that that stakeholder is mainly irrelevant. Moving on to our second argument, how it benefits society. So we have 2 layers of analysis for this one. Firstly, on rehabilitation and reintegration, and secondly, on the victims. So firstly, as I said before, most of the criminals that are in this criminal justice system currently are racial minorities or just poor people in general. We believe that they are the people who were coerced and they didn't actually want to commit these kinds of crimes, but they had to because they didn't have any choice. Therefore, we believe that they actually want to have a life. They want to be able to rehabilitate. They want to be productive in society. And therefore, by having this policy, we're going to be able to help them to do that. If we are able to erase everyone's memories and if we are able to wipe their record clean, then they'll be able to find a job. They will be able to find friends, and they will be able to stabilize themselves and get themselves on their feet. We believe that they are able to actually reintegrate into society to a point where they no longer have to return to crime, which is one of the biggest issues in today's criminal justice system, recidivism. that happens when people simply like they get out of jail, but oh no, they're in the same position as they were when they left jail. Therefore, that means they're still in the same position where they have to turn to crime because they are being denied jobs. That means they can't make any money. They're being denied friends. Therefore, it's going to be detrimental to their mental health and physical well-being. All of those things, because we're erasing those memories, that's harm is going to be erased, and they're going to be able to rehabilitate. Secondly, on the victims, we believe that once we erase the crime, that also erases the victim's memory of the crime. Therefore, their trauma of that and their memory of that moment will be erased. We believe that this is extremely important because these kinds of moments and these crimes, especially for the victims, it's a lifelong effect, and that's why a lot of punishment is like justified because we need to protect the victim, we need to get justice for the victim. Well, now that justice has been served, we believe that instead of having this victim suffer, like continue to suffer for all their life because of this one moment that they didn't have any fault for, it would simply be better if we just erase that memory. Then they would be able to continue life and live a better quality of life, not knowing about the trauma and the detrimental experience that they face. For example, sexual assault and abuse, those things are often very, very detrimental to the victim, but then very, very detrimental to the victim. And we believe that to sum this up, what are we going to do? We're going to have less crime. We're going to be able to benefit both the victims, the society, and these criminals. And before ending my speech, I just want LO to answer this in their speech. They have two choices, retribution and rehabilitation. We want you to answer. And for all these reasons, I'm very, very proud to propose.
Thank you very much to the Prime Minister, and it's time for Leader of the Opposition to open the case for the op team.
Am I audible?
Yeah, all good.
My speech starts in 3, 2, 1. The proposition gave us a question about if we choose retribution or rehabilitation, and the answer is retribution, which I'm going to further explain on why. We think that rehabilitation, although rehabilitation might be important, we do think that retribution is much more important since when we have retribution, and the victims will be able to since victims they have hurt victims, we think that retribution is very much important to realize that they have actually done a crime and they chose to do the crime and they should not do it anymore. We think that this is very much important, not just for the criminals and the victims, but also the whole society to see that this criminal has been retribution and justice actually happens. And if you do a crime, then you shouldn't do a crime because retribution actually happens in today's status quo. So before I move on to our own arguments, I'm going to briefly rebut their case and their contextualizations. So they first said that they're going to leave the person who did the crime with that memory, which when this motion should be this house will erase the society's memory, although we do not think that a criminal should be left out. In the core spirit of the motion, we're still going to argue why even if we go with their definition, we still win this debate. And also and we think that in the status quo where deterrence and retribution is also important as because if side proposition wants to solve crime rates and wants to see the victims get achieving justice, we think that this is very much important. So moving on to some rebuttals. So their first argument was about principal high grounds. Even though they are poor and even though they had some circumstances, we think that the criminals actually chose to do the crime in the first place. And yes.
As Brooke characterized too, a lot of crimes in the status quo are economic crimes, i.e. crimes that are forced and are coercive because people need to do those crimes. How do you respond?
Well, we think that in those kind of the cases, although even though they were economically suppressed, we think that they actually choose to do the crime when they could have just live on and have many other options to not do a crime and actually live on. And even if that's not the case, we don't think that in today's motion we're just talking about bread thieves or something. We think that there are other various crimes that affect the whole society and so on. So going back to the debate, like their second argument about how it benefits the society, and I already told you that we're not only talking about like bread thieves and those kind of people, but rather like people who have raped or actually done much more severe crimes than just thievery. And we think that when victims' trauma is erased, that is the core reason where like that is the core reason why we oppose this motion. And so I'm going to further explain in my arguments. This is where victims are not protected if we erase their memory. So let's move on to our own arguments. Our first argument is about deterrence and retribution. Although we think that when this motion should actually include criminals in the society, because after like their sentences they will actually come into the society and become a citizen, we think that the like deterrence and retribution would not happen to normal citizens and also especially victims in this case, because like even though like during the process of when they're in jail they'll know the crime that happened and what they've been through, they will still get their memories erased and they will not know, right? But and like for example, if it was like a gun shooting or something, then like it costs someone death, or it maybe costs maybe the victim needs medical care or something, and if the victim does not remember, then like they suddenly somebody of the government comes up and says that you need medical care, and like they don't know if they need something. And like we think that this is a key reason why victims should not get their memories erased. And also secondly, we think that this is very much important since they'll be like if they don't have this traumatic memories as they characterize it erased, then they will not know that this kind of thing happened and they wouldn't be careful in the future, right? So we think that this is very much important in those kind of cases. Now moving on to our second argument about the awareness of citizens. We think that citizens, even though they characterize us as like after like during the sentences, they would know that this crime happened. After the sentences, they will like forget it, right? So citizens would not know what kind of crimes that happen, and like they wouldn't be able to get educated about what happened right now, which means that victims will less likely to get all the support they need to fulfill proper justice, and sometimes that is needed. Like sometimes there are protests happening where they give so less punishment for some kind of cases. We need the citizens to know this in this case. But secondly, because for protection, when like for example, if there is abuse going on, like child abuse, then school teachers will have to know like before what kind of happened, and they should know if this is child abuse or not, and like maybe like some protection measures such as not leaving children alone or something. We think that those kind of cases, this is very important. Awareness of citizens is very important to solve the to like develop the justice system, and also for like deterrence further on. For these reasons, I'm so proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech, and it's time for DPM to continue the case for the government side.
Sorry, am I audible?
Yeah, all good.
Okay, thank you. Then just to clarify, again, my pronouns are he and him, and I prefer POIs through voice. And with that said, my time will start in 3, 2, 1. A huge facet of controversy in the 2020 presidential USA elections, i.e. Biden versus Trump, was the huge facet of controversy regarding should we allow prisoners, former prisoners and former convicts to vote, right? Because there were so many former convicts that were coerced into committing crimes. There's so many African-American racial minorities that were coerced into doing these sort of things, that because of that, it could potentially tip the scales of Biden versus Trump, right? We tell you that what this example shows us is, first of all, that it is obviously extremely coercive towards racial minorities, something that they tried to push off, or something that they tried to like rebut to, but obviously couldn't via like multiple layers of analysis and whatnot. But second of all, it's also going to prove something that I'm going to get into in my third and final substantive point within my speech, right? Let's quickly get into some extraneous rebuttals rather, before we get into some questions, answering some questions, and then our final third substantive point. The first extraneous rebuttal being regarding their point about how criminals are a part of society, so they should also get their memory erased. And how, like, even if it's not the case, criminals still need to remember so that they don't do these crimes again, right? First of all, we already proved to you in Brooke's speech to answer the second part of that rebuttal, right? We already proved to you in why people aren't going to want why people aren't going to want to go back into society. Criminals aren't going to want to go back into society and actually better themselves if they can still remember, or if like society remembers what happened to them, right? We tell you that like when basically all of society shuns them, especially when they're already stereotyped racial minorities more often than not, right? They're not going to want to go back into society if they can't get a job because it's on their track record forever, if they can't make friends because it's on their track record. Right, we tell you that because of this fact, it's simply going to they're simply not going to want to actually get and get recidivized into society. But we also tell you that criminals, even though criminals are a part of society more or less, we also tell you that because of the fact that they obstructed the laws of society, because we tell you that they obstructed what society is fundamentally built on. For that reason, they're also somewhat disconnected from society, right? Second extraneous rebuttal then, which is regarding their quick point about how people choose to do their crimes, right? Like we told you on multiple layers of refutation and examples why this isn't the case, right? I told you earlier in my speech, and Brooke also gave me multiple layers of analysis as to why those who are those who actually have to steal, like those who are racial minorities, are generally speaking and cruel. Like it's the harsh, cruel reality that these people are generally more often than not people doing these sort of crimes, right? So we tell you that we don't really see what they're getting at there. Next, they talked about how like this debate isn't just about thieves, how it's also about rapists, murders, etc. Right? Brooke specifically told you in her speech, however, or in her definition earlier part of her speech rather, that this debate isn't really applied to rapists and murders, right? Because we defined to you very clearly from the get-go that because rapists and murders are probably serving life sentences in the first place, and because the motion literally states that once a criminal has completed, emphasis on the completed part of that motion, right? We told you that because of that reason, rapists and murders are still going to be remembered by society while they're serving their life sentence at the very least. So we told you that this sort of level of learning and level of awareness can still apply. Let's talk about their next main extraneous rebuttal rather before we get into answering some questions. Right. So basically, the first thing that they talked about, the next extraneous rebuttals that we'd like to talk about, was regarding that point about how we need things like protests, etc., for unfair trials. First of all, we tell you that they again largely misunderstood that point, right? Told you in her speech that because regarding these huge heinous crimes, because these people are already in jail for whatnot, right? In the short term, we can still have these sort of levels of check and balance and whatnot, at least in the short term, to create some sort of change. But even if we buy our worst case and say that this sort of thing can't happen, we tell you that because these unfair trials are so marginal and quantitatively it's so rare, we tell you that even if we take our worst case, that impact isn't super huge. Before I move on, I'll take a POI.
Then how is your side going to have any deterrence for the criminals that had the
okay, look. The thing is, first of all, nobody wants to go to prison, right? We didn't say that people aren't going to have to go to prison in our world. People aren't going to suddenly go hey, well, society's going to forget, so I'm just going to commit a crime, but you're still going to have to serve your sentence. That was our whole argument about proportionality in Brooke's speech, so we implore you to listen. But second of all, we actually tell you that retribution isn't the answer, right? An eye for an eye and the world goes blind. We tell you that if we can actually recidivize, we can actually rehabilitate these criminals to get integrated into society. Not only does that does that impact benefit the prisoner themselves, right, or the former convict themselves, but also benefit society as a whole. Let's get into a quick question before I move on to my final argument regarding recidivism versus retribution, which is better, right? So basically, we tell you that, for example, regarding another thing that they talked about, we actually tell you that things like retribution is better because when it's regarding rehabilitation is better than retribution because recidivism and rehabilitation can actually incorporate these people back into society and can actually make them prevent them from going back into a life of crime. Whereas retribution just makes everyone go blind, and retribution just does all of these things that Brooke already preemptively rebutted to, and I already rebutted to earlier. Let's get into then really quickly a second question before I move on, which is regarding the question of who helps society more, right? So on a micro level, this includes people like victims, and on a macro level, this includes society as a whole, right? I already extraneously rebutted to their macro level of societal awareness earlier. So let's go into why we benefit victims as a whole better. Largely regarding their point earlier in the previous speaker regarding how our world causes confusion for the victims, and they need the trauma to be able to be careful to not get raped in the future, right? First of all, this is a gross, horrible assumption and characterization coming from the previous speaker, right? She literally is basically implying that rape victims are she's basically blaming rape victims for not being careful enough to prevent their crimes in the first place, but just ignoring that, right? We tell you that we would much rather have this lack of general awareness from the victim than having them have PTSD, than having them like have their entire life ruined, basically, right? Now, finally, to get into my last substantive rebuttal or substantive point, it's regarding how we create a better political scene, right? I characterized to you in the beginning of my speech why, like, and Brooke also told you why a lot of the people who are getting convicted in the first place and indicted in the first place are people who are being coerced into doing so, right? So we tell that when we actually do things like allow people to vote again, like getting rid of their public track record and allowing them to allowing former convicts, for example, to vote again in places like America, right? We tell that this can actually create a better political discourse and a more incorporative democratic society as a whole. While this is a marginal benefit, yes, we tell you that it's simply the cherry on top of the cake. We clearly win this debate.
Thank you very much. And it's time for DLO to continue the round.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, then my time starts in 3, 2, 1. So, Ms. Speaker, in today's debate, the side proposition thinks that just erasing all of the memories of the citizens will just make a lot more the society a lot more safer, and the victims of each crime won't remember their traumas at all and will be so beneficial. However, in my speech today, I'd like to rebut to the previous two speakers and explain our last argument about development of CJS to rebut what the previous speaker said. And before moving on to our argument, I'd like to rebut to the previous speaker. So the previous speaker talked about like how having like proportional amount of punishment is important. Therefore, like only having like the punishment that they had in like prison or these stuff are all just proportional to their crimes. However, we believe that in our side, we believe that the things that the society know and the harms that they get from the society when the society knows that they are a criminal, that is also a proportional amount of punishment that they should get in the society. Yes.
Okay, so how can you fight for the principle of justice if, by your own logic, like we're not giving fair and just sentences and having proportional sentences in our world?
Okay, so I'm not saying that like you're not giving like proportional sentences in like such as going to prison, but we're saying that it is not like justifiable to erase the memories of these people just because you want to erase the trauma and these experiences so that they could these criminals could go in society and do better in society. We believe that this is principally not justified, and they also talked about like the benefits of society and how they're going to have recidivism. However, we believe that this is going to be like these harms are going to be more on proposition because people will be able to like not know about like the crimes that these criminals have done. We believe that our previous speakers already mentioned. However, people will not be like less careful about like these criminals and these crimes that might happen. They're not going to be aware about like the criminals that have happened in the past, so they won't be careful. Such as like, for example, a person might have been like kidnapped, and like if the society doesn't know, they will be less careful. I'll not take any more POIs. And then the previous speaker also talked about like how it will erase the victim's traumas. But as I said, as our previous speaker has mentioned, there will be more confusion because there is still like scars or like in their body, like there for example, like in rape crimes, like these victims will have like some sense of like a hint of the experience that they had. And for example, if a certain person got like murdered, however their relatives doesn't know exactly what happened, it will be more harder for them to like cope with these adversities that they are going to face after their like friends or families have been murdered. So this is going to be even harder for their mental state. Therefore, we believe that their argument is not justifiable. And moving on to like the rebuttals about like our argument for deterrence, we believe that their like answer to their POI, like we believe that this is not enough because this is not enough on their side because the society has to see what effect caused the consequences that the criminals had to face in the end. So we believe that this doesn't like we see that deterrence is more important because this prevents crime from actually happening in the first place. And we believe that if crime doesn't happen in the first place, there's no need for any retribution or rehabilitation in the first place. Therefore, we believe that deterrence is the most important value in the criminal justice system. And they also talked about like how retribution is important because they so society won't have to remember what these criminals have done, so they will be able to contribute to the society more. However, we believe that this is not true because as I said earlier, the society has to remember what the criminal did to them, and we believe that retribution will happen more on our side because in their side, the victims won't remember exactly about what the criminal did to them. So this actually lessens the sense of revenge when they actually go to prison or when they actually cause the consequences. Therefore, we believe that our side has a upper hand in the value retribution. So moving on to our last argument about the development of the criminal justice system, we believe that judges are also in a member of society that needs to have these memories of the crimes if they want to judge properly. However, we believe that judges make decisions based on past experiences. However, we believe that interpreting the rulings on legal precedents and procedures are going to be very hard for the judges if their memories are erased about past crime scenes. So we believe that to develop more criminal justice system and to develop more laws, we believe that it is very important for the citizens and the government and everyone to remember about what happened in the past in order to enforce laws and whatsoever. And we believe that if a certain crime continuously happens, we see that in the status quo there's reforms of laws and there are changes of laws, and we believe that there are a lot of society members of society that contribute to make a better criminal justice system and a safer society. However, we believe that if propositions just erases everything about the memories of the crime, we believe that this won't happen at all. Therefore, we believe that this is going to be a big problem in the criminal justice system in the long term. And we believe that others to rebuild on what our previous speaker has mentioned, she talked about how there's going to be more awareness in the society. We believe that this is also very important because as I said earlier, if they don't have any awareness, we believe that there's going to be less people talking to the police. There's going to be less people that are going to see that this is a crime. And they said about how they're going to have still have poor people has had a lot of crime rates. We believe that this kind of knowledge won't also not exist in the first place if they don't see the patterns. So for all these reasons, I am more than proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech, and it's time for the government whip to continue.
Okay, so my personal pronouns are again he or him, and just to remind you again, I prefer PYs verbally. With that said, my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. So there's this really famous quote from Gandhi that if you give an eye for an eye, then you basically go blind, right? That is exactly what we see, what we think will happen under their side of the house, right? We tell you that the result of a system that basically prioritizes retribution and deterrence over every other value is terrible, right? People are coerced into crime just because of the fact that they were born into a poor background. For example, they might be a racial minority. Their parents might not be having higher earning jobs. And that is basically the reason why, for example, because of their background and because they have no other alternative to choose from, the only way they can survive is through crime. And the answer the government gives is that after they commit crime, they basically put you in jail and you are forever not unable to rehabilitate properly. This is so that society knows that you have a crime record. And that is the precise reason. For example, people will not give you jobs and people will not give you opportunities to try again, right? That is exactly what we want to prevent under our sector house, which they largely misengage on. I only did a couple of things in my speech. Firstly, some extremist rebuttal to especially what their second speaker just talked about. Number two, first area of clash on who has the principal high ground in the debate, and second area of clash on who benefits society more. So firstly, I want to rebut to their point about how CGS will be developed. So just to clarify here, we talked about, so our policy was that we're going to raise the public records of the crime, meaning that people in the government will still have access to those kind of records, and there will be a certain database within the government. And judges, since they are part of the government, they will also have access to the information. They will also have memories of that crime. Number two is on how victims will be less careful, which we think is a really misleading point. So number one is that you can't foresee you getting shot in the streets. you can't foresee yourself getting raped in the streets. So even if you are aware of those kind of crimes, that basically helps you in nothing. Because the thing is that, for example, a lot of parents are aware of the fact that a lot of children in the South Korea are getting kidnapped, but them being aware of that doesn't mean that they can really prevent their children from being kidnapped, right? And the thing is that the harm that we provided to you was so much bigger in terms of magnitude, right? The harms that we see in the South Korea that comes to victims are things like PTSD, right? They blame themselves for the crime, and they, for example, in extreme cases, have things like suicidal thoughts, right? All of that against a single point called awareness, which we don't even see the benefits coming from. So in terms of weighing, we completely beat this point out of the debate. So first area of clash and first question in this debate: who has the principal high ground? Yeah, before I move on, yes, let's take a PY.
Then how are you going to stop like the society from reporting criminals when they see a crime scene if they don't know about any criminal records?
Well, they still know the law, right? Still, they know the law that if somebody takes away another person's private property, that is theft. Just that they never saw an example of it, and they don't have a memory of an example. So people still know the law. So I have no idea how the argument makes sense in any single case. So first question we have in this debate is who has the principal high ground. So number one is on what we need to prove in order to win. Just to clarify, this clash is basically rehabilitation versus retribution. So we basically need to prove to you that rehabilitation is the only just way in this case. So secondly, let's move on to some framing of the crimes and criminals. And the thing is that, which is a really important point where they never really rejected, is that most of the crimes, the super majority of crimes are economical crimes, and the super majority of criminals are poor criminals, right? Meaning that those poor people, the minorities who were born into a terrible background, basically the dark part of our society, the failure of the government, those people were coerced into committing economical crimes to live, right? We tell you that that is the case for the super majority of crimes in the South Korea, right? There are certain heinous crimes committed by certain cycles, but that is only a very minority, which you don't really see the harm coming from. So here's 4 pieces of weighing metric for you to know, for you to understand how rehabilitation is more important. Number 1 is on governmental duty, right? It's under their side of the house. No, I already took one, right? Under their side of the house, the government basically neglects the criminals, right? After even when those kind of criminals are mostly the failure of the government is like, oh, we don't care about your background, just go to jail, and you're not going to be able to properly rehabilitate for the rest of your life, right? We tell you that that is principally incorrect, right? So under our side of the house, the government apologizes, right? The government basically gives them another chance to restart. The government, for example, provides ways for them to restart, for example, like rehabilitation centers. They erase the memories, meaning that those people will not be stereotyped, and they will be able to, for example, start again, for example, like get a job and like continue on with a stable life. Second point is about proportionality, right? If those people do something wrong, then in the law, we presume that the amount of sentence they get is the proportional amount of punishment, right? Meaning that, for example, I stole something from someone, then the law presumes that 2 years of sentence is the proportional amount of punishment for me. The law assumes that, right? That is the justice system. Under their side of the house, people are punished again by society, and because of their criminal records, they cannot get jobs. They will be stereotyped by people. They will not be able to live a proper life, right? According to the justice system, that is incorrect, right? Because we presume that those people already got the amount of punishment that they need, right? Thirdly, it's in terms of magnitude. Because the case when we fail, the case when our principle doesn't work, is really small cases where, for example, it's like heinous crimes, like murder or rape. That is only like the 0.1% of crime, which you don't really see the harm coming from. And on their side, there's a super majority, which is, for example, like economical crimes, like poor criminals, which we think is when the harms are maximized under their side. So second clash is who benefits society overall. So we gave you all those impacts of rehabilitation, which they basically gave up to engage in, right? So number 1, we told you that there's going to be more productiveness in society, which is basically for the greater good, right? There's going to be more working force. There's going to be more people who are actually willing to live a better life under our side of the house, right? The thing is that under our side, it basically prevents recidivism. Because you commit crime and you basically have nothing to lose, right? If you have a lot of things to lose, if you have a family, if you have a stable job, then there's basically no incentive for you to commit crime because you're going to lose everything, right? If you have nothing to lose, and that is the moment where you get the incentive to commit crime, right? And that is actually the case for most of the criminals. They're extremely poor, they have nothing to lose, but the only choice they have is to commit crime. For all those reasons, because number 1, we basically have a landslide win in terms of principle, and number 2, we also benefit society, which is something that they never really touched upon properly. For all those reasons, we're extremely proud, and I beg you to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. And now it's time for the opposition whip to continue the round for the opposition team.
Okay, my time starts in 3, 2, 1. Speaker, are these actions justifiable in the very first place? Is it okay to leave our own citizens being stabbed and being thrown into pools of blood just because people will forget it? We believe that it's very, very brutal coming from the society of the government. So just to clarify one more thing, the opposing team has told us about how poor people have higher crime rates. However, we believe that even this knowledge would not exist on their side as well. So moving on to our first clash about crucial values. So throughout this debate, speakers, it is so easy to see the missing values inside the government's world. So while the citizens would constantly have to deal with the extreme crimes such as murder, rape, and so on in that particular moment, it is a definite fact that these citizens would be in very, very much pain, right? So what is the government doing at this point where people are perpetually suffering? When the side proposition is foolishly opting into erasing everyone's memories and justifying their actions because of the blackout in all people's heads, we believe that this is when they clearly fail to serve their primary role as governments. So going deeper, in the first class, we'd like to elaborate more upon the deadlock about the essential values about the essential values still existent and do they matter. So even that this deadlock should be broken and proven on our side, right? So I prepared four layers of analysis for this point. So number one, we need that in this sense of essential values, we talk about values like retribution, deterrence, and the knowledge of citizens, like awareness. So in the society of the proposition, it is crystal clear that they lack these values. In the first analysis, I like to prove why these factors are so important in all societies. So so why is this important? It is because the citizens need to feel safe when they're living within the societies of the authorities. They need to be ensured with the fact that they're provided at least with the minimum amount of care and the assurance that the government is investing their efforts to serve as stepping stones towards society. If these factors lack speaker, then it now becomes clear that those authorities have greatly failed to manage that world. However, number two, even if we say that because people forget these awareness is not because people forget these awarenesses, it is not needed for higher protection. We believe that the injuries resulting from crimes along the lines of raping or severe physical damage, like being hurt by a knife, forgetting those memories does not cure the injuries anyways. So in the world of the government, they lack the necessary protection where the injuries themselves do not change anyways, even if they delete, even after the brainwashing, right? So at the end of the day, speaker, this proved why the missing values would form a dreadful society where people have severe or even lethal injuries without even knowing why and questioning those injuries. Number three, we believe that even if the previous points are not true and the government team couldn't care less to the effects that are imposed towards their own citizens, which is very irresponsible, but still because the government seems to like this thing, we think that the criminals themselves would also apply to being impacted by the mechanism. So if criminals can continuously forget about their past actions that the blackouts continue, there will not be any deterrence because criminals would never get to know the consequences physically unless they commit to another crime, which is an immense loss for the government, right? And lastly, number four, even if criminals are not considered as the conscious society and are able to receive their memories back, like what the government defines in today's debate, it is still a very, very big harm for said government and their society because criminals would be the only ones doing their secretive actions with no one else being aware of these possibilities, such as the citizens in the society. So what would happen then, speaker? Then there will be endless crimes occurring time by time because the criminals know that they would not be stopped as much as in the first place. So looking at these consequences coming from side opposition, side government's world, we believe that it's so easy to see the chaos that will be brought to the affirmative side's world. So moving on to our second clash, what is the standard of being enough? So speaker, we believe that their standard of running their whole society is not at a sufficient level or amount, where they're simply relying on everyone's basic thoughts in the society. So as they're emphasizing the fact that they're still possessing the value of deterrence because no one would want to go to the prison in the first place. So we tell you, Judge, that the mechanism they're running in their own society is inadequate from the very get-go of this debate. So we believe that said government is being very, very assumptive in today's debate, where they're believing their own claims would fulfill every need that are actually very required within the society itself. It seems like another value that they think is enough in existing in the society is regarding retribution, where they're claiming the uselessness when people will not even know what has happened anyways, which will not require retribution. However, we think that in a nutshell, this is very irresponsible coming from side proposition, right? So we believe that they're eliminating every other external factor in the first place, where they're believing that victims' trauma would not become an issue anyways. However, we have two example cases prepared in today's debate. Number one, the leftover clues of injuries that are the outcomes of the heinous crimes. And number two, under the case, someone has been actually murdered. So we believe that the world of the government proposes in today's debate is simply being sugarcoated as they're constantly repeating their assurances for the society to calm their citizens down. But no, they're clearly lacking the acknowledgements for the perspectives of the citizens themselves. What we currently see coming from side government is their intuitive guesses where they believe that they're creating a system that is beneficial for the citizens. However, for this point, I'll be proving to you why their foolish beliefs are not true. This is because there's a very, very high possibility for them to for the citizens who are the victims or the family of the victims have
Thank
even more
you.
mental issues and chaos for citizens, because due to the memory erasing implicated directly from above from the authorities, now the physical and visible clues on their bodies will never get to have an answer anyways. So, or another case, someone may be lost from the family group because they were murdered, where other members would not even have an answer for where this person went, or any other things, which should give them even more confusion and chaos. So seeing that the Thai government cannot even properly differentiate with their own with what their own assumptions are and what the actual considerations from the citizens are, this is why we tell you that the Thai proposition greatly fails to fulfill their duty at the end of the day. When they're indirectly accepting answers to immense big impacts. And additionally, as speakers, we believe that on-site government, there will be less reports coming from the citizens saying that they have witnessed a crime scene before it happens, before the actual murder or something else happens. Because when there is these absence of memories, even if there are basic education about crime on-site government, the citizens would still never get to fully know the details of a crime scene because they forget anyways. So finally, the opposition has also finally, the outside opposition also has rehabilitation centers, which means that we are making this situation much better by not implementing this mechanism in the first place on our side of the house, right? So because the government cannot properly fulfill their obligation as authorities, I'm very glad to oppose to this motion. Glad to oppose.
Thank you very much. That concludes substantive speeches, and it's time for reply speeches, starting with the opposition reply. Quick reminder, these are 3-minute speeches without POIs. So whenever ready.
My speech starts in 3, 2, 1. What is rehabilitation? Like, the purpose of rehabilitation is to make criminals productive members of the society, right? But when we see that criminals, they are the only ones who, like, according to side proposition, who has the memories, and nobody else can know that, then that becomes a clear reason why they could actually do the crime again and again. Like, for example, where like criminals who did rape have a high possibility of recurrence, it becomes a whole where, like, if side proposition tries to rehabilitate, they just simply lose the whole purpose of this rehabilitation if they're just going to do the crime again. So mainly in my speech, I'm going to further prove to you how, like, their biggest impact about, like, how poor people who became criminals who get rehabilitated will not simply work from the get-go of today's debate, and like compare the two sides. So, like, as I stated in my opening, we think that the purpose of rehabilitation itself is to make criminals productive members of the society, and, like, to fulfill the purpose, they need to like settle in the society, and it also means that they shouldn't do the crime again, right? In order to actually stay as a productive member of the society. And in this case, we think that, like, like, we see a side proposition who believes that if they come out of jail again, they'll and nobody knows that he's a criminal, then he's going to better rehabilitate somehow. But if they had like, if they couldn't get a job before he went to jail, then how could they simply assume that they're going to get a job after they went out from prison, right? This is very much, like, this is just a huge assumption. We think that, like, after the rehabilitation process, it's not like after the rehabilitation process, like, if they are not stable, and, like, maybe if, like, not like they say that not all, like, criminals who did rape actually get lifelong sentences. In this case, there are nobody to monitor those kind of people, and they, like, for example, in the Stars Code, we have apps that tell you that there is this kind of criminal near your house, so you should be careful. And those kind of measures cannot be announced to the public and the citizens because they simply couldn't tell, and their memories are erased. So this becomes a whole for criminals to do the crime again, and that ruins the whole purpose of the rehabilitation. And we think that sometimes rehabilitation is less important, right? Because, like, we want everyone to know that there's a criminal and you should be careful. And it's not exclusive, since we also have rehabilitation measures, even though that might be weaker than side proposition. So we think that since we have rehabilitation and deterrence and retribution on our side of the case or inside proposition, they only express a rehabilitation, which will not work if they're simply going to do the crime again. It does not fulfill their whole purpose, and their like biggest impact from the start of from the get-go of the debate does not stand so proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. And now it's time for the last speech of this round, which will be the government reply speech.
Okay. If I'm audible, then my time.
Yes, you are.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. If I'm audible, then my time will start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, let's be really honest here. This was a pretty wishy-washy debate. So as the final speaker in this debate, I'm just going to clear everything out to you and show you why proposition clearly won. Let's get into the first metric in which we won this debate, the first of which being the meta-debating metric, right? The first subcomponent of which being the reasoning subcomponent. Let's just weigh both teams' arguments and substantive reasoning points within this debate. The opposition team's arguments basically being 3 things. First of which, retribution. Second of which, awareness. And the third of which being family, which Brooke characterized that since Brooke characterized that like criminals will still be in jail, and as a result, society will still know about the criminal, doesn't really stand, even though they focused on it so much, right? Whereas we juxtapose that with our arguments, the first of which being our principal justification argument, having 2 layers of analysis, proportionality and coercion. Our second layer of our second argument being that we benefit society as a whole, again having 2 main layers of analysis, that we benefit former convicts and victims, and third of which being that we also benefit society as a whole regarding better political discourse, right? We tell you that, first of all, their arguments of retribution didn't stand because they never proved to us why people aren't, they never proved to us why our principle of our principle of proportionality, for example, didn't stand. And they also didn't even rebuild this argument after DLO largely. The second argument about awareness didn't stand because Alvin, even at its best, weighed out, and even at their best, even in its best form. So it largely didn't stand in this debate either, right? We tell you that regarding reasoning in this debate, it was largely trivial, like being harmed physically as a rape victim and being confused, for example, is a largely trivial harm that we already engaged to a lot. So clearly we win on a reasoning engagement, a reasoning point. Let's talk about an engagement point and why we also win on that then. First of all, opposition didn't engage with our principle of proportionality until DLO. Second of all, we do concede to the fact that political discourse and our argument about it wasn't that well fleshed out, but they didn't even try to engage it, so they didn't have that. And thirdly, we tell you that largely their engagement within this debate was very strawman-like and trivial, right? First of all, they're like rebuttal to us about how we don't have deterrence, right? They never proved to us why no one will like want to go to prison, why people don't want to go to prison, or why people will want to go to prison rather in our world, right? Another rebuttal that was very strawman-like was about how like people are just going to do it again, and how that came out in the previous reply speaker even, right? First of all, prison is a good deterrence metric, right? But even in Alvin's wonderful speech again, right? He told you how a genuine feeling of connection to society and how no burden regarding your background and a criminal background, for example, especially, right? How those sort of things can actually lead to a better life, and how those things can lead to genuine reintegration and recidivism into society. Clearly, they didn't listen to our engagement, and they also didn't engage with our case well because it was very strong. Let's then just get into a quick best and worst case comparison, the second main metric as to why we win this debate, and get into that best and worst case comparison and analysis as to why our worst case takes our best case. So our worst case is that we don't have deterrence, but that's not really true largely, and they never proved why prisons are appealing underneath even our worst case, right? Additionally, our worst case doesn't have awareness, but that's largely not exclusive, and also even at our worst, Alvin already weighed it out. Let's just suppose that with their best case then, seeing that they have awareness, right? And criminals get what they deserve, but that's not really true since they never proved why our argument of proportionality doesn't stand, and they also never weighed out the argument of awareness after Alvin already proved why on a comparative basis, even at its best, it didn't weigh out with our worst role. So for all those reasons, we clearly won this debate in all fronts, and it's obvious, and I beg you to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech, and thank you to all debaters.